Welcome. I'm so glad that you came to take another dark ride with me and hear yet another story from our collection of tales from the Hearse. We're back in Riverside Cemetery again, but this time we're down in the lower parts of the graveyard. And you can see that there aren't many tombstones about down here, just a few scattered here and there. This is where the poorest people were buried, those who couldn't even afford a marker. However, there is one tombstone that I want to show you in this area. Here it is now. Yes, this marks the grave of a woman that the locals called Crazy Mary. Now, Mary lived a long time ago. She had parents, of course, a mother and father. She was just a girl when our story starts. Her family lived in a very remote area, and they didn't have a lot of interaction with the community. They were very self-sufficient. They knew how to live off the land, had just enough land for a little clearing for a garden, and they had a few chickens. What they needed, they could trade for on occasion. But they knew very much about herbs and plants and how to make remedies and medicines from them. They were an interesting couple. Mary's mother was Cherokee, and her father had Scotch-Irish roots that went all the way back to Celtic times, and he held to the old ways. Yes, they believed in the fairy folk, in spirits of the earth. But they passed this knowledge on to Mary, knowledge that included how to make remedies from plants. Well, there was at one point a time in which Mary and her parents were out gathering these plants that they needed to make these medicines. And a storm came up suddenly out of the blue. A torrential rain, the kind that can even make small creeks turn suddenly into raging rivers. Well, Mary was separated from her parents. They were on one side of this stream and she was on the other. They could see each other though, and her parents with horror watched as Mary slipped off the bank into this rushing river. Well, they of course jumped in to save her. Mary was able to grab the root of a tree and pull herself out of the water. But her parents were not so lucky. The current was so strong it swept them both away and they drowned. Well, even though Mary had survived, now the community needed to decide what to be done with this orphan child. Mary was quite self-sufficient, just as her parents had been. They had taught her well, and she made an argument to be able to remain by herself in the little cabin that her parents had built. Well, in those days, they didn't demand that she be shipped off to an orphanage or that she had to attend school, so they let Mary stay there. And Mary did quite well, to be honest. She made a good living for herself, and like her parents, she kind of kept to herself, not socializing very much. Now, she had a reputation eventually. Part of it was based on the fact that Mary had a strange appearance. She suffered from what we today would probably identify as being scoliosis, curvature of the spine, and that caused her to have a very humped over posture. In addition to that, she wasn't particularly attractive. She had a large hooked nose. And she also, because she lived by herself, had the habit of talking to herself, which people who live by themselves often do. But she didn't worry too much about her popularity. She was quite content, and she did have one constant companion, a large gray cat that she called Gruff, because on the rare occasion when anybody did happen to come by her cabin, oh, that cat would hiss and spit at them. But with Mary, he was quite happy. It would be very easy to see, if you did happen to pay a visit upon her, to find her sitting with that cat resting on her shoulders. The cat clearly loved Mary, and Mary loved that cat. Now, I don't know if you might have ever owned a cat that lived outside. Well, if you have, you know that they sometimes like to bring you little presents as they hunt. They might bring you mice, squirrels, maybe even a small rabbit upon occasion. Well, Mary appreciated those gifts. She made use of them as she did everything in her immediate area, the plants as well as the animal life. She took those little rodents, for the most part, skinned them, kept those pelts, and being the resourceful person she was, she sewed them together and made a cloak for herself for the winter months. Well, you can imagine it might have looked rather strange to have all these little skins stitched together, but it worked quite well. But it added to that strange appearance that gave her the reputation for some people to think of her as a witch. Well, they would call her names. That's where the Crazy Mary part came in. And when the boys would sometimes see her in the woods as they would be about their play or hunting, they might call to her, "Oh, Crazy Mary," and all sorts of taunts like that. But she just didn't pay any attention to them. On one such occasion, when Mary was out gathering herbs and Gruff the cat was doing some of his own hunting, there were some boys that were out hunting squirrels. They just had the one rifle among them, and it didn't always shoot. Well, they hadn't had much luck with the squirrels, but they did happen to spy Gruff, Mary's cat, as he was creeping along on the hunt himself. Well, you can tell where this story's going. It's not a very pleasant place. They shot that cat. And that's not all. Remembering Mary's cloak with all the little skins of the treasures that Gruff had brought her, they thought it would be funny to skin that cat and to tack the pelt up on the door to Mary's cottage, which is what they did. And then they waited in the bushes to see what would happen when Mary returned. Well, they got exactly what they wanted, quite the reaction. When Mary came back and she looked at the door and saw what was there, she let out the most pitiful moan and cry, and those wicked boys laughed. They laughed as they scurried off into the woods and ran back to their homes, but not before Mary marked each face, knowing well who they were. Now that winter, there came about the worst epidemic of influenza that had happened in many, many years. It swept the eastern seaboard and thousands of people died. Many died in Mary's community, but not quite as many died as would have otherwise if Mary had not, with her generous spirit, helped out with the knowledge that she had from her remedies that she made from the herbs. And she traveled from house to house where the doctor could not go, and saved many lives. And the people remembered that kind act. But you know who did not survive that winter? Those wicked boys. Each one of them died that year. Oh, the doctor wrote it off as influenza, but privately he told people that their deaths were absolutely horrible. Their limbs swelled up, filling with fluid, to the point where the doctor said what actually killed them was that they drowned in their own fluids. It was like the bubonic plague. Well, Mary lived on to a ripe old age. And when she died, the community actually remembered her for her kind work, and they made that tombstone in memory of her. And people say that even today, when you walk by that tombstone, especially on a nice, warm, sunny day, you might find a big, large gray cat sunning itself there on Mary's grave. I like to think that Mary and Gruff were reunited after death. So this little tale has a happy ending after all. Thank you for joining me for another one of our Tales from the Hearse. And please remember that you can buy my book, The 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror, at gestaltmedia.com. See you next time for another dark ride.